Great. So let's go ahead and get started. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Marco Salazar, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Be Social Change. And welcome to this change management webinar. We are going to have a really fun and engaging conversation with Kristin, a change management expert. I, in a previous life, was going to go down the path of change management. It's a real passion of mine because it's so integral to the function and success of organizations. And there's definitely organizational elements as well as individual elements things that we can do in order to grow the capacity of an organization and help maximize its impact. So welcome, Kristin.
Hi there, Marcos. Thanks so much for having me. So good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too. So Kristin has been on a panel of ours before, and we just wanted to have her back because she just has such amazing insights in terms of how to help organizations run in an effective way, as well as produce really good culture. So to get started, I'd love for you to just share a little bit more about yourself and the work that you currently do.
Sure. So my name is Kristin Demophiles. I am a director of org design at Nobel Collective. And Nobel is a company that sort of sits at this intersection of strategy and culture to really answer the question around how do we help people transform what they do and how they do it together. So we help teams work better together, develop empathic and ambitious leaders, and help those leaders accelerate change. So some of the things that we'll typically do with our clients is take them through some change sprints, which basically is sort of a self-managed, agile, iterative approach to making change that is determined by the group that we're working with. We'll do coaching or leadership development, skill building, capacity building at the individual and team and organizational levels. We'll do things like strategic planning, but with a more agile spin to it. So we call that adaptive planning. As everyone knows, this year, what a lot of folks at an organization or company planned for in January is certainly not where everyone is in terms of where we are now, and there are a lot of pivots that have to be made. So that hopefully gives you a sense of some of the work that we do. Yeah.
Awesome. And we're going to dive into so many aspects of this. I really want to understand the type of empathy work that you do, as well as the change management sprints. And one thing that I'd like to note for people who are attending is that we're going to have a good amount of Q&A at the end. So feel free to ask a question during this entire time. Our amazing Jennifer Lashansky is going to be pulling all those questions together, our Chief Engagement Officer. So put a big Q and colon in front of any question, and she's going to pull all those questions together as we dive deeper into this conversation. So I'd love to even start at kind of this higher level and kind of make sure we're on the same page and demystify how do you define change management?
Sure. And Marcos, would also love to hear it from your perspective too, just because you have a background in this as well. I think the simplest way that I like to talk about it, just because sometimes even the phrase change management gets folks a little bit tense at times, what does that really mean? And so I think about it as the process of moving from one state to another. A lot of times when we talk with our clients, we'll talk about, so what's the from to here? If you really had to get specific about what needs to change at the team level, organizational level, whatever. Is it moving from one structure to another structure? Is it moving from something that's a little bit more like waterfall style in terms of how you launch a product, to working something in a more agile way and applying an agile mindset to the work? Is it moving from a culture that's very siloed to one that's far more cross-functional and collaborative? So thinking about what is the from to is really how I like to simplify what change management is, and being able to do that with intention in a way that involves all the folks who are involved, so that change is not happening to folks, right? But rather something that they're part of.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the concept of from one state to another. And then the other element that I think about is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So you then have to do it in a particular context, right? And really context is key. And that really helps to form the intentions and the strategies that you shared of how you move. So that's kind of like the how. And I think the other element, and I'd love to get your thoughts, is that we talked about how we're going to talk about organizational as well as individual. And that's what happens during that change, right? There's the structural changes from an organization, but an organization is simply two or more people, right? And it's made up of people. So how do you end up empowering individuals to manage that change as well, not just put things into place from an organizational standpoint?
Absolutely. I think those are really important points. And I think one of the, to build on that, like there's the context, right? And then there's the communication that's involved. And then like that, when Nobel works with any of our partners, we think about involving a cross section. So it's not just something that, to your point, like happens at a vacuum that's just at the top, right? It's like, how do we have a diagonal slice of the folks who are impacted by this, whether a contributor, a stakeholder, whatever the case might be, to really make that, to have folks get involved.
Yeah. And I guess one of the other things, like, there's so many things I want to dive into, but even again, taking it from the top, when someone or an organization comes to you all to create this change, what's that first step or process that you take them through?
Great question. The first piece is really about us understanding. So one of the things I like to think about as a change practitioner, right, in its broadest sense, is wearing the hat of an anthropologist, so to speak, to really understand, like, what is the context? What is the culture here? Like, what are the norms? What are the values? What are the beliefs? What are the behaviors, right? Like, what artifacts are around? And when you pair that with a sort of design thinking, like how do you put the users at the center, right, of anything, right? Like how do you pair those two things together? And so what that typically looks like is some sort of listening discovery period, which we, again, get that cross section of folks who are involved to really get a sense and hear from them in their own words. What does it look like when you're at your best? What are the pain points and challenges that you have? What are the elements that you would never want to change or see like altered about the culture, about how your team works together, and where is there room or where are the gaps? So that typically comes from just empathic listening, and getting a sense of, okay, where do folks think they need to change, and what's happening at various levels? Is there a discrepancy? Are folks on the same page or are they not? And then from there, we can provide recommendations, and really find ways to get folks involved to start implementing change that they feel is most important, most urgent, most necessary.
Yeah, you're making me think about kind of even just an analogy is that it's important to get that cross section of everybody. Oftentimes change is implemented at the top and then everybody has to adhere. And there's a difference between everybody intentionally or consciously doing this together versus change coming into the top and then everybody at the bottom catching up to the change and having to necessarily adapt. And that's, I think, one of those important things. And I think what you pointed out also, and I think about this organizationally and even individually, is really front loading or spending a lot of time in that discovery phase, because that really sets the foundation for everything else. Otherwise, you might be playing catch up or you're implementing things in the wrong way. So that's why it's so critical, that beginning stage.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And we actually work a little bit more fast paced in the discovery section, not to eliminate the nuance and the richness of what you're talking about, but to really get enough of a baseline to start with, because we like to develop rapport and relationships with the folks in the organization. That way we can continue to get that nuance, not just at the beginning. Like, we'll get enough at a good baseline, but then continue to build and refine as we go, as opposed to just front loading it and then just sort of working from just that period of time. And I think that iterative process of continuing to build in the nuance and learning as you go, in partnership with a client, actually is it's very rewarding, because it really helps create that partnership, that thought partnership, in building solutions together.
Yeah, I'm super glad you said that, because you're making me think. So my background is in organizational management. That's what I got my master's in, and But this was, dating myself a little bit, this was kind of in 2008, 9, or 10. And what's really interesting of what you're just describing is that was really before lean startup, agile development, and really these sprints and doing things in an iterative way. And I tended to focus on much larger scale organizations and corporations that spend this huge amount of time at the beginning and then implement something. I think the thing you're pointing out is that it's very easy to take that corporate approach where you build something out and then you only implement 30% of it, right? Versus that iterative approach that you're taking in a lean way allows you to continually adapt over time. So can you share a little bit about what you mean by that in those change sprints?
Sure, absolutely. So oftentimes I sort of walked through like our accelerated discovery period. We'll share some insights in terms of what we're hearing, what are the themes, and then sort of develop a squad to sort of tackle some sort of change that we're seeing in a theme. So for example, more cross-functional collaboration, right? So if we can get a cross-section to work on a squad, I would say like a pretty small group that can work in a sprint fashion. So often in product development, right, you have a certain period of time in 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it really depends on where you are, in which you sort of break down like, what is it that we're going to try and do? And what is like the simple thing that we can test and try sooner rather than later. So a concept that I'll bring into here is this idea of building a skateboard rather than a car, right? So a lot of times folks want to build a car, right? Which can take a lot of time, a lot of money to say, okay, like here's the engine, here are the wheels, like, and then, you know, at the end of a long period of time, you say like, hey, here's a car to get you from point A to point B. When actually you could have just used a skateboard to get from point A to point B and say like, hey, was this good enough? Did this help you meet the goal that you were trying to get from my house to a coffee shop, for example, right? And so maybe it wasn't the greatest experience to sort of hop on a skateboard, but once I'm able to provide feedback to someone, I'm like, well, here's my experience from like taking this skateboard down the road into the park and whatever to get to the coffee shop. I actually needed some steering. So the next iteration of that would be a scooter, right? And maybe that doesn't work, but then maybe we realize that a bicycle is enough. And actually I didn't need a car because it's close enough and I can actually take a shortcut on a bike path, right? So that's sort of the metaphor for how we work in change sprints, where we'll work with a team and say, hey, you need to work more cross-functionally to launch a campaign for a marketing organization, for example, right? Who are the folks that need to get involved? And like, what's the skateboard that we need to try? Is it just, you know, having an earlier debrief from an insights team so that folks can use those insights to drive some of the things that happen afterwards. So sort of working with the team to say, okay, here's what you want to try. What's the smallest version of that so that we can get some feedback right away and then iterate from there.
Yeah, and I think what's nice about that is there's a combination of strategy and things that you're putting forth, but learning is such an integral part of it, and more importantly, validated learning. And it seems that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in those kind of smaller chunks, instead of thinking about this strategy and making big decisions for years on out, it's easier for people at all different levels to plug into those sprints because they're easier able to contribute to those kind of specific things and learn along versus thinking about executives that are projecting all these possible visions and strategies moving forward.
100%. One of the things that we often draw on and share with teams that we work with is actually coming from Google's Aristotle project. They pumped a lot of R&D into understanding like what makes a high performing team, right? Like, is it a certain amount of personality profiles? Is it, you know, like the ping pong tables and the incentives that you provide them? Like, what's the special sauce? And it's really less about those specific components as opposed to the chemistry between the people who are on the team. And so essentially what came out of that research is that there are sort of 5 traits that make a high performing team. The number one being psychological safety. And that's the idea that it's okay for me to take a risk and be vulnerable amongst the whole team. So that isn't something like, oh, I can just like do whatever I want because I feel comfortable. It's a shared belief that everyone can do that in a way that there's no retribution, right? Like there are no wrong answers. There's no shame involved. And psychological safety is something that Amy Edmondson from Harvard sort of coined. And I can share some research and resources on that afterwards as a follow-up. But the other components are dependability, right? Like, can I depend on high quality work from my peers on time? And then another piece of that is structure and clarity, right? Like, do I know where my lane is, where my role begins, and where someone else's begins, right? And what does that mean to sort of have that structure, enough structure and clarity so that folks can work seamlessly together? And then there's an aspect of both meaning and impact. And I think, that is sort of the collective level of an individual piece, right? Where it's like, what sort of meaning or significance, reward do I get from doing this work? And am I able to see if it is different, making a difference, right? So like, what's the impact of what I'm doing? Is there a way for me to understand, if I'm on an IT team, for example, right? And I'm helping a business partner, like an internal customer, right? Like do their work. I know that when I help someone use their tools and technology better, they're able to better serve their customer, right? Like, so the psychological safety, the dependability, structure and clarity, meaning and impact are all the things that make the most high performing teams.
Yeah, and I remember reading about that, and it was interesting the psychological safety as being the number one. It seemed to be a little shocking to some people. But this leads to something really interesting relating to change management, which is when there is a change, it can disrupt someone's perception of safety, right? When there is a technological change and or implementation of a technology, and someone's been using an old system for 30 years, they feel threatened and their job feels threatened, and more importantly, their identity could feel threatened. So because it's tied up to this old technology, how in your work or what are advice or what do you do to help people navigate that type of change on an individual level?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up because I think this is something that's so relatable right now, whether it's technology or current state of affairs, whatever the case might be, right? One of the things that we like to share with teams and orgs, no matter how involved they are with some of our work or not, is really just help orgs think about change as loss. Oftentimes, when we think about loss in general, it's like losing a game, like your favorite sports team has lost a game, or grieving loss. But change actually has sort of like 6 types of loss that keep resurfacing, right? That you're alluding to, right? So that's a loss of control, right? A loss of pride, a loss of narrative, like who am I now that the technology is different, or we're following a different process, or we've pivoted our mission. Loss of time. I mean, certainly anytime you change tools, you lose a lot of time. Loss of competence and familiarity. And I think right now in this moment, this sort of like prolonged uncertain moment that we're in, people are experiencing a lot of that, not just in their personal life, but in their professional life. And those things have blended together for, that pocket of knowledge workers who are now working at home. And so being able to frame change as loss and these types of loss, I think is really helpful for folks to have a shared lexicon to talk about change with each other and to process it for themselves, right? Like now that folks are working from home, where have I lost a ton of control? I know folks who are caregivers, for example, just they're stretched really thin and the sphere of control is very limited and very different than what it looked like before this pandemic. So anyway, giving that framework and that understanding can help folks reflect for themselves as well as talk to others about it and build that connection.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to frame that because there is a known process, and varies individually, but of a grieving process and that loss process and framing it in that kind of way. When I was getting my master's, I had a really fun and amazing professor who was leading research in this and really thinking about during organizational change, what's the trauma that takes place with people during that change. And she was focusing on, and I'm trying to remember the language she used, but it was loss of formal and informal networks. When there is a downsizing and you lose coworkers, there is trauma because you're losing those relationships people that you may be spending more time than your significant other with. So how do you implement and integrate that emotional navigation and support when there is that type of loss in an organization?
Yeah, that's I'm so glad you brought that up and framed it in that way, because one of the things that we recommend and work with folks on is, how do you honor the ending, right? Like, a lot of times we'll see, especially leaders, right, who are ready to make this change, they skip to like, okay, we're on a new chapter. And what really needs to happen is you need to like honor that ending and actually start with the end first, and really reflect on the legacy and history, and acknowledge that something is coming to a close, right? And then after that, there's a period of adjustment, right? Because it's hard to let go of things, and it's only when you've done those two pieces of honoring the end and leaving space and room for an adjustment is when you can actually go to a beginning and transition into that. And so this is where I think a lot of ritual building could actually, it's something that's been top of mind for me recently, and I've been coming back to, in terms of how do you develop rituals that can help at an individual or a team level in coping with all of this change. And when I talk about a ritual, this is something that has intention. It has a trigger, right? So either a time, a place, there are people involved, and a flow, beginning, middle, and end. So this is not, when I say ritual, it's not a routine. A ritual is something that is mindful, not mindless, right? And a routine is something that's usually automated, sort of like you can kind of coast on it. But I think having a ritual when you welcome someone to the team, or when you say goodbye to someone on the team, for example, is a good way to mark the moment and really make note of that, whether that's an ending or a beginning, and turning an average moment into something that is more memorable and meaningful.
Absolutely. And I'm going to get back to a few things that you said, but I want to do two things. One, we're going to launch a poll to just share, to get a sense of who's in the community right now, as well as I wanted to make sure that people who have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat with a big Q, and then we'll be pulling those all together and answering at the end. But feel free to, Jen, go ahead and do the poll. And you should be getting a pop-up on your screen, and you can go ahead and answer the poll. And it just launched. Thank you, Jen. And we will be just quick 30 seconds. Feel free to just answer very, very quickly, and we want to just get a sense of who's in the room. So after this next question, we'll share the poll results. So you pointed out something really interesting. I love honoring the end. And what you're making me think about is also when someone passes away and you're grieving that loss, but you're also honoring that person's passing. And it really ties into emotional management, right? And dealing with emotions. And I think with leaders, that's one of the jobs of a leader. It's not just structural, it's not just putting policies, but I see a leader as helping people manage their emotions and supporting their emotions during this transition, because that tech person who is struggling, might be in a fight or flight response, scared of all those elements of loss that you shared, they could see this new change as two ways: as a threat to their identity, to their job, or a challenge, right? And a leader's job is to manage and from a policy, structure, and emotional standpoint to help the organization see this as a next challenge to be moving forward. So what's the type of empathy work and that type of leadership work that you all do?
I think that's such a great question. I think to start, what we like to share with leaders is that there's generally three types of folks that you'll encounter when you're trying to implement change, right? You'll have your champions, so the folks who naturally are inclined, to your point, to see it as a challenge. They're on board, they see the meaning in it, they feel like they have a role to play. And then there's most folks who are fence sitters, who are sort of waiting for the wind to blow and just sort of like waiting it out. And then you have cynics, right? The folks who may be more resistant, who may be sometimes difficult to work with in implementing change. And I think one of the things that's most helpful to build that empathy for the cynics is that cynics are generally people who have had their heart broken. So they are folks who have perhaps experience in the past with trying to implement change, and they've been burned before. And so we just like to have that simple framing of like, there are three types of people, and you can think about engaging and empathizing with those folks from with those in mind. Of course, we'd never want to oversimplify anyone's experience, but really focusing on champions is where you'll get a lot of where you'll see a lot of success, because they can help get those fence sitters on board. And once you sort of go through a lot of folks seeing the positives in the change, from buying into it, adopting new behaviors, things like that, the cynics can come around to that because they're seeing the evidence that this is actually different, but it may take a little bit more time than usual. But cynics are also really powerful, so spending time understanding their perspective and learning from whatever history or legacy experiences that they have is also really important for leaders.
Amazing. So Jen's going to mute herself, and she's going to share the results.
You should be able to see them now, but you can see that 8% are entry level, 23% are mid-level, 31% are managers with direct reports, 10% executive, 19% in transition, and 10% other.
Awesome. So a pretty wide variety of groups of people. And I want to provide an opportunity for some Q&A. So before we transition to that, I'd love for you to just share, how did you get into this type of work? What was your career trajectory to lead you to this type of work?
Good question. So I have sort of been in change work sort of on the side without realizing it for a good portion of my career. I had experience in the tech sector working on some enterprise software products. And then when the company decided to move into building consumer applications, that was like a new line of business, a new set of products that I sort of had to get folks on board with. And so that was something that I was already starting to implement change. Like, we're taking this new approach to and adding on to what we do as a company. How do we build new processes for that? How do we engage with consumers differently in a way that we hadn't before? There's a lot of elements of change and change building and coalition building internally that I was sort of doing that I didn't necessarily have in my initial job descriptions. And then when I moved into the nonprofit space, there were a lot of things that I took from the tech world that I was applying into digital research and digital marketing, which was new for some of the folks that we were working with. And so doing a lot of that internal change work was, again, part of my role in a way that maybe wasn't explicitly listed when I first joined that organization. And so, as I had this experience leading teams, influencing stakeholders, bringing folks together do something, to achieve a shared goal, I was really learning a lot about teams and how teams work together and what are best practices and how do you get folks motivated and what makes change work, and how do you do change on terms that people can really get invested in. And so when I decided to pivot, it was really realizing that, oh, wait, I have done this work before. And that's a common story for a lot of folks who are in this space, a lot of folks that I work with at Nobel. We sort of started in-house, so to speak, working on change initiatives in a particular area and said, wow, this is really cool. This is incredible. And so I started looking at that work and was lucky to be connected with Nobel, and here I am.
Awesome. And there's a few other questions that I have, but I want to open it up again
Sure.
to some questions. We have a few questions in here. So we'll go ahead and, well, first of all, big thanks. This was a super fun conversation. And then we'll get through some of these questions, and then I'll ask a few others. So the first one from Megan is, which is something I was interested in as well, is what are some of the rituals you've developed, implemented during COVID? And this aligns, I was going to ask you about what can organizations do further in this context. So Megan, thank you for that question. What are some of the rituals you've developed or implemented during COVID?
Such a good question. I will say first that some of the things that, when back in March, some of the things that we implemented then are not the things that we do now. And I think it's important to recognize that rituals sort of have a period of time in which they're effective and important, and sometimes they evolve. So one of the things that we did early on was we would just, at the end of a week, we would, check in on what are some of the challenges that we've had, how are we coping. One of the things that we always do that I think is really important, something everyone can take away, is at the start of a meeting, right? Asking folks, what are you bringing with you? Right? Just doing a human check at the start of every meeting to create psychological safety, to do some cognitive offloading, to relate to people as humans, as people, right? And sort of manage expectations. So that's a ritual that we do all the time, even pre-COVID, but is something that we stress is even more important now than ever. That just, that's the trigger, right? Like at the start of a meeting, we're gonna go round robin of what are you bringing with you? And I think that's particularly helpful. I think, at the end of projects, we go through certain retrospectives to help understand, like, what did we learn from this? What can we modify, take away, and move forward? And while we generally do that with projects, we also do that at a team level. So those are some of the things that we've done. I think I saw a couple folks sharing some more of their personal rituals, which I think is really great to think about as well. Even just setting aside time in the morning to drink a cup of coffee and, do a meditation practice, I think is something that's really helpful for folks right now, to just, if you're able to cut out a little bit of time for that, to ground yourself. I mean, that's something that a lot of folks can do.
Yeah, and you're reminding me of, so one of my favorite books is Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and he wrote the book he was one of the first researchers on happiness and joy and kind of meaning in the 60s, and he did research with thousands and thousands of people, and the most unhappy part of the week isn't Monday going to work, it's actually Sunday morning. And the reason why is because your day is the most unstructured throughout the entire week. So that unstructure, lack of rituals, lack of habits can actually cause a lot of distress. And that's definitely the case right now in COVID, where we actually have to create our own structure, right? So those rituals and those habits that you shared are so important for people in terms of just like getting and orienting themselves to be not only productive, but just like well in general.
Yeah. And I think to to your point, because there isn't as much structure and there's so much that's uncertain, I think shining a light on wins and celebrations and successes, whether that's sort of triggered by time at the end of each week, if there's a celebratory moment that happens anytime you launch something or ship something out or just complete something, like what's the small ritual that you can do to really mark the moment of achieving something, of doing something, of making something happen, whether that's big or small. Often we think about that in such big moments, like launching a big product that's, you've been working on for months. But I think creating micro goals is really important, and thinking about the ritual to celebrate those things is more critical now than ever.
Absolutely, absolutely. So next question from Teresa is, what is the typical scope, time frame, intensity, frequency of interaction with teams for your engagements with the clients you are working with?
There isn't one clean answer for that, Teresa, but I'll share a little bit about some of the typical ones that we do. If we're working on something like a transformation project, where there's a lot of organizational change and culture change that needs to happen, we could work with a group for 2 months, 3 months, up to a year. We've done things like that. And in those change sprints, we're working with those teams on the ground weekly, if not more, just sort of like, how are we starting our week? How are we ending our week? And how do we make sure everyone's doing something along that way to make those skateboards, really, really clean and concise, so that folks don't take on more than they can chew. For something like team building, capacity building, that might be a series of upskilling sessions that we do over the course of, that build on each other over the course of 6 weeks, 8 weeks, things like that. We are industry agnostic, and for us, our main passion is like how to make teams work better together. And so we're definitely in that discovery insight process, like trying to understand what will work best so that folks will actually adopt whatever change needs to happen. So whether that's skill building, that's generally something smaller, but a lot of like larger change where there are a lot of pieces, that's something that's typically a longer engagement.
Great. So next question is, thank you, Teresa. Maria Lynn, what types of master's programs set one up to work on an executive level in change management and training?
Oh, Marcos, this might be something more for you, because you have more formal training than I do in this way.
That is true. So I got my master's at George Washington, and it was structured, it's a different program now. It was in organizational management, and they had a master's that could lead to a PhD. I think it's now infused with industrial organizational management. In a previous life, I was going to go to an organizational behavior program, and that's at Harvard, which is this mix of the psychology department, partnership psychology department, and the organizational behavior department in the business school. So there are a wide variety. I think you might want to look to see if it's part of a PhD program, and that you can be part of that. For my organizational management program was really interesting in that it was a lot. I was in DC, so there were tons of people from the FBI, the military, the government that were taking classes, but it was a focus on organizational management versus finance. So it wasn't an MBA. It was like an alternative MBA with a focus on organizational behavior rather than finance. So those are the things you have to work through. I think there's a lot of programs that do that, but IO Psych, organizational behavior and organizational management, and some MBA programs could focus on that. Any other thoughts on your end?
One of my colleagues did an organizational design and development course over at Columbia. If on the design front, Stanford, obviously has a ton of programs that I think are really interesting. So depending on how, if you're committed to something formal, certainly there are plenty of programs. But there are also a lot of smaller sort of courses, workshops that you can sort of start to dip your toe in the water. To see if that's something that you really are inspired and energized by.
It's kind of like the sprint model, which is you do something quick, you see how you emotionally respond, and then move forward from there. That's awesome. Great. So then we have the next question from Daniel. while you pointed out that change management may be regarded as various forms of loss, I'm wondering if no change may be considered as a loss of sorts as well, loss of opportunity, etc. I'm curious to see your thoughts about no change in that respect. So it's interesting thinking about the world is changing, but then your organization isn't changing. Any thoughts on that?
That's such a great question. And I want to take a moment to really reflect on that. And
we can go back to it if you want.
To think about it. No, I do think that's there's always that sense of what could have been, in terms of, to your point, like the loss of opportunity. I think one of the things that is important in coping and navigating loss is also thinking about your sphere of control and your sphere of influence. And so while there's certainly that aspect of loss of opportunity, one of the things that we like to focus on is what's within your sphere of control, right? And so there is a loss of things that might have been, or what that changes. But I think having that in, also sort of looking at that with the realms of your control, like the smallest circle, which is your sphere of control, the sphere of influence. And I think that is a totally legitimate feeling of loss right now, for sure. Because there are so many other pieces that are tied to it. And one of the things that I hadn't mentioned about like the types of loss is that none of those things are independent, right? Like those are all interrelated. And so I think that's another great area that articulates part of what's so hard right now, for all of us.
Yeah. And then we have just a few more questions. What are some tips for helping organizations that rely heavily on restricted government funding to undertake structural change? So they might be dependent externally on the ability to change.
This is something that's been on my mind recently because a lot of government structures tend to have a lot of checkpoints in place for how they work with vendors. And we had submitted something that was very unconventional for a government-related entity that actually sort of made them think more about how they go about selecting vendors, and if their current process and checkpoints for that actually makes sense for the type of work that they want to do. And so just to reflect back on that, I think resourcing a change process, I think there are a couple of sort of, to come back to that iterative process again, right? If it's difficult to do that like in a sweeping organizational way, where are some pockets that you can start? And is that providing specific individuals with a little bit more coaching, some of like the coursework, getting exposed to what does it mean to be a change agent, right? Like how do I sort of firm up some of those things, and then maybe expand that to, find an advocate or a sponsor, and then build out from there. I don't know if I'm fully answering the question, Marcos. Can you repeat it one more time?
No, the question is that while you pointed to many change being regarded, this is the restricted government funding to undertake structural change, and is what happens if you're, I guess the question that I'm thinking about, and on a larger term that's relating to lots of people, is what happens when you're maybe have one hand tied behind your back when it comes to change because you're dependent on this type of funding or some kind of external element of the change.
Yeah, that's such a challenging situation to be in.
But I think the thing that I'm just really thinking about is that unless you can change that, it really relates to your sphere of influence. Like unless you can change that, you can either change your business model so you're not reliant on that, or you just have to take that into your account. And that's just one of those fixed variables when you're thinking about your change. And I think, as you're moving forward, is the change that you try to diversify those funding sources, or you adapt your organization because you are reliant on this?
Yeah. And I think one of the best ways to sort of pitch that is to just make it a pilot, right? Like, why don't we just try it? It's not something we're committing to. It's like a skateboard, right? Like, what's a small thing that we can do that is within our sphere of control, just to try it. And if anything, we learn, and the impact of it is not catastrophic.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, good. So a couple more questions. What are some of the strategies you find effective to help the cynics join the change?
Oh, the cynics. One, I think always listening and learning from cynics is important. We will generally, I think it's important when engaging with cynics to think about how much time you're spending and investing on that, just in terms of, you have limited time, resources, energy now more than ever. And really focusing first on those champions is actually the best use of your time. That's not to say that you should ignore your cynics. But like I mentioned before, it just takes a little bit more time and evidence to really get that cynic on board. But simply asking something like, what would it take for you to feel more comfortable with trying this new way of working, to doing something differently, right? In one of our prior engagements, there was a cynic, and we had a conversation around like, well, what's a pain point that you have right now? Like, what's something that's really bothering you? And that person just really wanted to have like no emergency meetings at like 5 p.m. Like that. We didn't realize just like how, that, making sort of like we're just not going to do this. We're going to try it for a week of like not having these like fire drills at the end of the day. Right. And see what that does. And so if you're able to find a small win, you can generally get a lot of trust and goodwill from a cynic. But just know that there's not a silver bullet for that. It's just, it's something that will happen over time. But if you can be strategic about those wins, the more they'll get on board.
Awesome. And then we have one more question from the community. And I think this could even sum up a little the things that we spoke about and you shared earlier. But the question was, are there any general pathways or phases for change, which you kind of shared about, and maybe you reiterating what those are?
Yeah, I think thinking about, there are a couple things that come to mind. So what I mentioned before around, honoring the end of something, really giving credit to something that has been done before. Oftentimes what got us here will not get us there, right? And so honoring what did get you here is so important. And understanding that period of transition is tough, and holding space for it. One of the aspects that we always remind our clients of when we're working in a longer term engagement is change always feels the hardest in the middle. Right? Like, I like to think about this visually as sort of being on a tightrope, right? Where if you're walking along a tightrope, in the middle is sort of like where you'll really hit the lowest point of feeling that on both sides. And so that transition period is really important. And then moving on to the beginning, and the beginning is never always like smooth sailing, right? Like that is really where you have that iterative, like, we are testing and learning and growing. And I think starting with behaviors on that can really help with the attitudes. One of the things that we like to remind folks is when you can change the behavior first, the attitude will follow.
Great. And to end it, what's kind of one next step that you feel people on that are joining us today can take in terms of improving their individually as well as organizationally, kind of keep navigating change during this time?
Such a good closing question. Good takeaways. A couple things come to mind. One, obviously at the individual level, I think self-care is so important. Like, this would be the time when I would usually say, put your mask on before assisting others. But now the change in that is put the mask on to help yourself and others, if you will. So I think that's really important to just like really reflect on your own capacity. This is a challenging time in ways that are both conscious and unconscious. And so doing a check-in, I think, with folks on your team is something that everyone can do, right? Like just spending a few minutes at the beginning of every meeting to just say like, hey, how are you feeling? That might be a professional check-in, like I have a big meeting coming up, it's stressing me out. Something personal, like, I didn't sleep last night because like the kids were just like running around and crazy. Or, whatever the case is, I think that's something that everyone can do to really help humanize where people are at right now. And then I think if you have capacity and energy, and I really caveat with that because this is a very strange and uncertain time. If there's something bold that you want to do, suggest it, right? Like figure out the skateboard for it and try it. I mean, 2020, a lot of things have surprised us to say the least. So why not suggest something different, provided you have the capacity for it, and you're sensitive to the capacity of others who might be involved. So I think that boldness plus that empathy can really, make some change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a perfect way to end, thinking about that self-care and being able to create that foundation for yourself and then being bold. I think this is the opportunity for initiating change and reimagining and recreating what you in your organization are doing, as well as where the organization is moving forward. So great way to end. Thank you so much, Kristin, for joining us. It was a really insightful and fun conversation. And we're going to be talking about, I just want to share a few things that are coming up with Be Social Change. So later on in the month, on August 25th, we're going to have a Be Social Change Mixer. So it's a facilitating networking event, opportunity for you to connect with other change makers and Be Social Change members. Something that's very related to what we discussed is on October 1st, we are hosting an anti-racist business summit. So we're going to have 8 speakers from diverse backgrounds sharing how to create and navigate change to make your organization, nonprofit and for-profit, to integrate these anti-racist businesses and practices and implement and move kind of this social justice movement forward that we are currently in. And then we also have a really great webinar that's definitely related called Mastering Time. So it's really, how do you build those rituals and practices so you master time management so that you feel good as well as productive. And then just wanted to share, I know we have a lot of Be Social Change members here. If you are not a member, it's a $5 a month or $49 a year membership. You get free access to all the events that we do. You have recordings to all our past events as well as all our webinars. So great personal and professional development investment to help you navigate this transition. So again, thank you so much, Kristin. Hopefully this is the first of many future conversations. Yes. And have a safe and wonderful day. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure. Thanks for all the great questions, everyone. Be safe. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
So we'll stay here for a few minutes. Feel free to, if you want to connect or network with anybody, feel free to say your name and anything in the chat. We'll stay here for a few minutes. Thank you, Kristin.